Is it too cold? Should I put the heat? I don't know. I don't.
Well, maybe she says we have to work, right? Yeah. Well, it's working somewhat, it feels cold.
Well, this is I don't like that either, baby.
Oh, really?
Where's the least cold?
Where is it around here?
Where's the least cold?
I don't know. No, it's something here. Okay, so. Please. Hold on, go get some hot chairs.
All right, the heat's on.
Now they have to put the heat out.
I mean,
Warm up.
yes, it's warm up here.
So I don't usually care about pocketbooks, but telling you, it's so useful and we have a limited, but I can't say anything. No, I'm in London. And it's not so useful. Oh, just the color. Thank you. But I didn't bring a Bible, so are there some?
The Bible's right there.
Oh.
Yeah. I don't need one this time.
Oh, thank you. Well, my car is being washed.
I know. I need to get my car washed. It's like really dirty.
I just pulled my car out.
Oh, you did? Yeah, you just leave it
Wash it
there. I just
and,
washed it.
You need to move it.
Yeah. Oh, you left the keys with that, with the little kid? They'll move it. Barney B will move it.
Well, so is this the second?
This is the
This
second.
is the second, right?
Out of four.
Well, it's actually out of 3 because next week there's a parish meeting and I forgot to announce the parish meeting.
Oh, that's okay. We have it.
It'll be in all the other stuff.
The banner.
So my request is to talk about it.
What?
What's your request? What's your request?
That we do another.
Oh, the fourth, oh,
fourth
it's
session.
July.
Well, you know, I'm not saying that's not, I'm just trying to think how we would best do it. So maybe we do a session in that second Sunday in July and
Yeah,
do it like more generally, like
like a week.
what biblical
recap.
questions do you have that you've never heard?
Yeah.
Or something like that. How about that?
That sounds great.
Ask Father Mark.
Right. And I might say, I don't know.
Yeah,
might
well,
be
you'd
one
be
of the answers.
honest at least. Yeah. Hey, instead of like
Worry about people.
people that are like, yes, yeah.
I don't know where she is today. So, so you go ahead. Okay.
Oh my God, are we all ladies here? Oh, no. Okay, I see. I think I saw Randy.
Probably Bob is here
Randy's
too.
here.
Oh, Randy's here
Randy's
too,
here.
right, yeah.
Okay, great.
So the short answer to Rosetta's question is, we could do a fourth one. I'm not sure if it's fit to do another one on Mark after it being off for a few weeks, but maybe a more general one. Would that be okay?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Great, okay. Remind me that I said yes to that.
Yes, okay, I'll put it in the calendar. So like the second, after the 4th of July weekend, right?
Yes, the Sunday after the 4th of July
Okay,
weekend, because that
all
would
right.
make no sense to do it.
Yeah, no, because people are gonna be away.
Yeah, they're gonna be
No,
away.
that's fine.
No.
There was like, this was like the very absolute.
The bottom of the
dregs
pie.
bottom.
They're not gonna have coffee at the bake sale, I don't think so.
Oh, they did, it was in the church. I mean, it was.
Yeah, in the coffee
Oh,
hour,
yeah.
yeah. I'm like, I had coffee this morning.
If anyone would want to have their car washed and was wondering how you were going to do both of those things, they can move the car for you. If you pull your
Who's
car
they?
into the line, they will move it for you.
Oh, you did?
I might be overly trusting.
I know, that's scary.
Just told the adults will move your car. That's good
That's
to know.
Yeah, I hope so.
Right, exactly.
Moving the cars.
Oh.
So I think, whoops, can you That little, there's a little below your foot there. Bernadette,
Huh?
below your foot, there's a little post-it. Thank you so much.
So what was next Saturday? What is it?
What's next Sunday?
Sunday,
No, Saturday? Oh, Pride.
Oh, that's,
Oh,
the-
Pride.
that's the,
the Pride
Fort
Parade.
Washington Pride Parade.
Oh.
So, and I
goes
believe
along
there
Main
is
Street.
a contingent, Rupali is, gathering it.
No, that's different.
And, so that Saint Stephen's has a contingent, right?
Yeah, they
So
have like a banner that
They'll be,
they made.
and she was looking for the banner, by the way.
Oh, I
She
have,
can't
it's
find
up,
the banner.
I know where it
Oh,
is.
okay, because she was like looking for it
Oh, I
frantically
think she was
today.
at, oh, okay, yeah, it's up in the,
If you have her phone, you might
no,
text
she's
her.
just texted me.
What's
It's in
that?
the Norfolk.
I think anybody who
Anybody who
to.
wants to, they have,
Yeah.
they have like Rapali, I think her kids are gonna be marching, and anybody else that wants to.
Am I gonna be there? I have to figure out if my schedule on that day is gonna let me, because for me, it's like an extra 2 hours to try to, to try
Oh,
to get
yeah.
that and figure out the rest of the day, right? Because I have
Right.
something else that evening, but, I will see if I can do it.
So what you look like you want to start?
At what time?
1 o'clock.
Thank you. Now we have all that information. That's great. That's good sharing of information.
More people to get the information. I'm going to tell you the banner, I'm going to tell you the location, I'm going to tell you the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
It's a Baywalk Park, Baywalk Park.
From Stop and Shop.
Oh, is that what it is? Yeah, and then it goes down to the band shell, I think, to the, Rosetta knows she's like, knows more,
Where is the Stop and Shop
down Shore Road, on Shore Road, which is,
here? So it goes,
if you know where you went to IHAM, it's like that street right there.
oh, okay. So
That
it's
Mediterranean cafe, yeah, you go down there, march up, and it goes to like where that,
Up Main Street.
yeah, it'll go like up Shore Road and then I think it ends at the, where the band shell is, like there's that baseball field and stuff by the piers and stuff, if you go down by Inspiration or down, where Louis.
So it doesn't go up Main Street.
I don't,
It's
maybe,
mostly on Shore Road.
maybe it will go up Main Street. I'm probably right, I'm not sure. I don't know the route. You probably would know.
I'm sure she would.
She marched like, she and her sons made the banner. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, good, morning still. Yes.
Yeah.
This is the second week in Mark's Gospel. And last week, just to recap, I said, I just briefly noted about, what we think we know, what scholars think they know about, who wrote this gospel, apart from somebody named Mark, right? And we have the name Mark associated with the gospel because the early manuscripts say on it, according to Mark, right? And that probably is the case because there were other gospels that were not according to Mark, and they wanted to distinguish or differentiate this one. But it's almost a certainty that there was not a original autographed manuscript that said the gospel according to Mark. That was put on later. And who wrote it? There is controversy over who that is, but the best guess is I understand it and believe is that is written by somebody by the name of Mark, who was a disciple of St. Peter, writing at Rome, where St. Peter went. Could very well have been his translator or his scribe, but definitely his disciple. And we know this because there is a early church writer by the name of Papias, who tells us he received this tradition from John the Elder, who is probably John, at least the writer of the epistles, according to John in the New Testament. And so it goes a tradition that goes back very, very early. and it makes a lot of sense for other reasons that I won't get into now. But in terms of his use of language and use of the Aramaic language in particular, also Latinisms, even though it's written in Greek. And his Greek is writing as somebody who is a second, that Greek is his second language, maybe his third language even. But he's obviously knows Aramaic, and so it goes to figure that this probably is the case, that it's written by a guy by the name of Mark, disciple of St. Peter, written at Rome before or shortly after Peter was killed under the persecution of Nero, somewhere around the year 66 or 67, something like that. Okay, so that's sort of like who wrote it. And as I said last week, you can cut the pie of Mark's gospel up into various ways, but I slice it in three parts: Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Last week we talked about Act 1, which really asks the question, who is this guy? He comes out of nowhere. All of a sudden he's at Jordan with John the Baptist. And then he's going about gathering disciples around him. He's going teaching. He's performing miraculous signs, casting out demons, healing those who were sick. Who could this guy possibly be? And we end part 1 with in chapter 8, verse 26, with the healing of a blind man. And the healing is gradual. It's not just, he just doesn't heal the person. He first of all sees the person being blind. The person being blind is only partially healed. He says, I see men as trees walking. And so then Jesus lays his hand on him again, and he's healed fully that time. But that also is an indication for us that we as disciples aren't immediately have full eyesight into who Jesus' identity is, but it's a gradual unfolding. That sort of that healing story gives us that that indication. But today we're going to go with Act 2, which is the shorter piece of the gospel, only starting, say, verse 27 of chapter 8 and through chapter 10. And then when we come together on our 4th week, which is the last week of the month of July, we will hit chapters 11 through 16, which is the starts of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem through Jesus' last week, his passion, death, and resurrection, and Mark's enigmatic ending. We'll leave that as a cliffhanger for the next time. But we have a short section this week, and that is Jesus on the way. This first section that we did last week is Jesus is in Galilee, doing his ministry in Galilee, which if you remember your Bible map, Galilee is and then let's see if I can. This is probably going to be totally useless, but I'll try it. If your Bible has a map, you'd be able to see this. But if you can't, this is Palestine at the time of Jesus. All this yellow stuff here is Palestine, Judea, and Galilee. Judea is in the south. Galilee is in the north. Jesus comes from the north, from the sort of the backwoods town of Nazareth, and he all of a sudden shows up on the scene at the Jordan River and is baptized by John. This week, and we have this ending with a healing of someone who is blind. This week we're going to be ending section 2 with the healing of someone who's blind as well. It's going to be a little bit different though than the healing that we see at the end of, or in verse that ends with verse 26 of chapter 8. Verse 27 is where we're going to be starting off today. But before that, I promised the folks at 8 o'clock that we're going to start out though with going back to one story in part 1, since we have a shorter section today. I mentioned in my sermon today that we have a gospel lesson that has a very similar story today, as Matthew tells it, to the one that Mark tells. Only he is more, Mark, in this case, even though it's a shorter gospel, is more elaborate in the way he tells the story, but it's the same sandwich, right? It's Official comes to Jesus. Woman interrupts him on the way, goes to the house of the official, and raises the daughter from the dead. Except that it's a little bit different. This is the way Mark tells the story. If you were to go, if you would like to follow along in chapter 5, beginning in verse 21 of Mark. Again, this is going back to Act 1 from last week. We'll be able to do another thing here with this. Okay. Verse 21 of chapter 5. I'm going to be reading from a different version than many of you have. I'm going to be reading from the Common English Bible. So you get a little bit of different twist, right? Okay. Jesus crossed the lake again, and on the other side, a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Jairus, one of the synagogue leaders, came forward. Now, by the way, in Matthew's gospel, it's not, does everybody have a Bible? Oh my goodness. Okay, let's make sure everybody has a Bible here before we continue.
One has miraculously appeared.
What?
One has miraculously appeared.
Yes. Okay, so if you wouldn't mind sharing, there we go. There you go, bud. Thank you. And once again, Jesus crossed the lake again. On the other side, a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Jairus, one of the synagogue leaders, came forward. Matthew doesn't tell us the name of the leader. And by the way, I will tell you a little thing that you may not have known about Matthew's gospel today. The people who translated the New Revised Standard Version, in Matthew's gospel, it doesn't say a synagogue leader. It just says a leader or an official. But they supply a synagogue leader because Mark says it's a synagogue leader. Matthew doesn't tell us it's a synagogue leader. Anyways, and he's unnamed as well. And he came forward. And when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded with him. My daughter is about to die. Please come and place your hands on her that she can be healed and live. So Jesus went with him. So the daughter is not dead in Mark's gospel. In Matthew tells the story that she already has died, as we hear today in the gospel reading, right? Please come and place your hands on her so that she can be healed and live. So Jesus went with him. A swarm of people were following Jesus, crowding in on him. A woman was there who had been bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a lot under the care of many doctors, and had spent everything she had without getting any better. In fact, she had gotten worse. So that detail is not included in Matthew. Matthew just says that she was a woman, had a bleeding issue for 12 years. Here, we're told that she spent everything she had on doctors and didn't get any better. In fact, she got worse. Because she had heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothes. She was thinking, if I can just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Very similar to what Matthew says, right? Her bleeding stopped immediately, and she sensed in her body that her illness had been healed. That's a little bit different because in Matthew, Jesus turns around and pronounces the healing over her before it happens, right? I mean, he's the one who in this case, she just simply touches him, and in that moment of touching him, the virtue goes forth from him, and he says, at that very moment, Jesus recognized that power had gone out from him. That's not in Matthew at all. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "Don't you see the crowd pressing against you? Yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus looked around carefully to see who had done it. And the woman, full of fear and trembling, came forward. Knowing what had happened to her, she fell down in front of Jesus and told him the whole truth. He responded, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace, healed from your disease." This is all very much more detailed than what we heard today in Matthew's gospel, right? So that section is much more elaborate than what Matthew tells. And while Jesus was still speaking with her, messengers came from the synagogue leader's house saying to Jairus, "Your daughter has died. Why bother the teacher any longer? But Jesus overheard their report and said to the synagogue leader, don't be afraid, just keep trusting. He didn't allow anyone to follow him except Peter, James, and John, James' brother. This, of course, is not in the text from Matthew either. They came to the synagogue leader's house, and he saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, what's all this commotion and crying about? The child isn't dead, she's only sleeping. Well, that sounds like Matthew. They laughed at him, but he threw them all out, almost verbatim from Matthew. Then taking the child's parents and his disciples with him, he went to the room where the child was, and taking her hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which means, young woman, get up. And suddenly the young woman got up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. They were shocked. He gave them strict orders that no one should know what had happened. Then he told them to give her something to eat. So much more elaborate story in Mark than in Matthew about this too. We also have an example. Last week I mentioned that throughout Mark's gospel, we have these little Aramaicisms that are thrown in, Talitha cum. So it gives it a sense of verisimilitude that he's remembering. And if Peter in fact is the one who tells the story, one can very well imagine that Peter remembered this and said, yes, he said, little girl arise. And Matthew doesn't tell us that at all. He just takes her by the hand. We read Matthew's gospel today and raises her up. And then this is the messianic secret talked about last week. He gave them strict orders that no one should know what had happened. Right. So exactly right. Yes. We should have that little meme. Yeah. Well, this is the mystery conundrum in Mark's gospel that's called the messianic secret. Why is it that Jesus says this, right? And a number of things of conjectures have come forward as to why that is the case. One is that he did not want to fully reveal who he was until it was manifested in his death and resurrection, because that's where that came to the fullness of who he was. His messiahship comes in that time, in his death and in his resurrection. Another is that some folks have said, and all of these may be true, they all can be potentially complementary, that who he was and what he was about was not about miracle working, primarily anyways. It was about bringing in the kingdom. And he wanted that to be the center and focus of his ministry, not all the stuff happening. And remember today, Matthew doesn't really have a messianic secret. He just says the report of this went out through all the district. In fact, that's how Matthew says it. But Jesus said, don't tell anybody about this, right? That could be the other reason. And also messianic expectations, that people thought, and we're going to get into this today, there were many ideas about what the Messiah would be when the Messiah came, operating in Judaism in the first century. But one of the prominent ones was, you're going to be a king, and you're going to come and take things by the reins, and you're going to gather a bunch of folks, and you're going to storm the city of Jerusalem and get rid of the Romans from here, as many did. In fact, that's what happened that destroyed the city of Jerusalem in the year 70. There was a revolt, the Jewish revolt, based on people trying to do exactly that, to get rid of the Romans. And what resulted in that? Eventually the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, the temple flattened, and in the year 70 AD. So Jesus doesn't want to be perceived as that kind of a Messiah that's going to be gaining this momentum of people and potentially leading to some sort of armed resistance and armed revolt. That could be another reason. All of those reasons are complementary. As I say, they don't necessarily mean that one has to be true. And maybe none of them are true. Maybe we just don't know. I mean, one of the things about the Messianic secret is that it probably is really Jesus. speaking here, because who would have put that in if it wasn't real, right? So that's that we have to let it be a mystery with these conjectures about why it possibly could be the case. Maybe you all have some idea about why it's the case, but those are what most folks think about why it's the case. But again, I mean, I think that the way Mark tells the story, and again, remember, this is like 10 chapters, Bible chapters, short chapters, less than Matthew, and yet he spends so much more time on these stories than Matthew does. Matthew sort of like gives you the Reader's Digest version of those three stories, and Jesus doesn't even give the call of Levi, or well, he gives the call of Levi. He calls him Levi, by the way, not Matthew, but we don't have it, as close to the story here. So there we go with that. Anything else about those two? And this just, the purpose of this was to show you how we had a gospel reading today from Matthew's gospel. It shows very different from what we had from Mark. Yeah, they're telling the same story, but the details differ, right? Luke also gives a version of the story too. We're not going to spend time looking at Luke with all three of them. Of course, John doesn't, because John doesn't do much of anything that the first three gospels have, what we call the synoptics, the ones who look at things with the same eye. This does indicate, however, what we talked about last week, that Matthew borrowed from Mark. Mark is probably the first written, and Matthew and Luke used Mark as one of their sources. We can see it because we can look right at what Matthew does, and in some places he's directly quoting Mark, right? I mean, we had our little pamphlet for today. We could have looked up and see, oh yes, that's exactly word for word of what Mark says. So it's a different tradition, but Matthew uses Mark as one of his sources. We said last week, by the way, too, that there are some pieces of the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that have similar sayings in them, and that's why some scholars have posited a document might have existed of the sayings of Jesus pre-Gospel writing. That document that scholars simply call Q, the Q source, and it comes from the word quell, which means the German word quell, which means source. And so basically it's the source of sayings of Jesus that may have existed. That was a very hot thing in biblical studies for a while, that scholars now are thinking, yeah, maybe it exists, maybe it didn't exist. We're not quite sure. This is what happens in biblical studies. There's sort of trends that everybody jumps on the bandwagon of, and which is probably true in other fields as well, right? What's that?
Among historians,
Yeah.
the past is constantly being reconsidered
Yeah.
because you have to publish it for your tenure.
Yes, exactly. That's very important. So today we're going to jump though into further moving into part 2, right? Act 2, beginning with verse 27. And again, you can slice the pie in a variety of ways. I'm slicing it in 3 parts, and my knife falls right into between verse 26 and 27. You could probably slice the pie in a number of other ways as well. You could put this next story actually in Act 1. If Act 1 is all about who is Jesus, this story fits right into that. The way that we're beginning in verse 27 of chapter 8, and of course, remember that the chapters and the verses are much later additions in the text. They weren't in the original, but in chapter 8, beginning in verse 27 in our modern Bibles, the chapters came first, by the way, and then as a way of like, demarking chunks, right? And only later from that did we get the little verses so we could hone in on one particular passage. Jesus and his disciples, verse 27, went into the villages near Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "And what about you? Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ." Jesus ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then Jesus began to teach his disciples, the human one, or the Son of Man, as you might have, and we can talk about that in just a second, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and the legal experts, and be killed, and then after 3 days rise from the dead. He said this plainly. But Peter took hold of Jesus and, scolding him, began to correct him. Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, then sternly corrected Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking God's thoughts, but human thoughts." And again, this is a little bit different than the translations many of you might have, because the Common English Bible versus the NRSV or the RSV. So, a couple of things in this. First of all, this is a question that Mark really wants to answer. Who do you say that I am? So we have that first section about Jesus doing all this stuff. Who is he? And Mark, I think, is saying to us disciples, okay, who do you say that I am? Who do you say that he is, right? Because remember, this gospel was written to be read orally, probably, and it was meant to be a teaching tool in the process of conversion for people converting to Christianity. That's what this gospel probably was meant to do. So who do people say that I am? Who do some other people say that I am, right? Like out there in the world, what are the theories about who I am? Who is Jesus, right? What are the theories that you could say? Right? You could have the Thomas Jefferson Jesus. Get rid of all the miraculous and the Son of God stuff and resurrection stuff, and just have the good moral teacher. That's who some people say he is. You could have the Jesus the philosopher, Jesus the wise sayings teacher, sage, and we could come up with various things that people have said about Jesus. He could be zealot. Like the can't remember the name of the author of the book that we were talking about last week. And then those are all the theories, and then here in this case, some say John the Baptist. John the Baptist back from the dead. Others Elijah, who's supposed to come before the Messiah comes, and still others one of the prophets. And he asked them, "And what about you? Right? Who do you say that I am?" So he's not speaking just to those gathered there, but to those that are hearing this, right? Because it's the gospel that's meant to be read. So I can imagine Mark or whoever was reading this to the little churches and house churches in Rome, lifting up his head at this point and says, "And what about you? Who do you say that I am?" That would cause folks to think about that for themselves. Who is Jesus for them? Who is Jesus for me and for you? Yeah. Any thoughts about that?
I have a question.
Sure.
You talked about they wanted to convert people.
Uh-huh.
And was there something to convert them to at this point, or was it just Judaism and this is an authority?
That's a very good question, Leslie, because at Rome there was a very strong Jewish community, but there obviously it's a Gentile city too, right? And then there were fully fledged Jews as part of the Jewish community in Rome, There were those who were interested in Judaism, who were like toying with it in the background, right? Thinking, this is very interesting. And those were referred to as God-fearers, that is, people who believed in the one God, the creator, and that element of Judaism seemed right to them rather than this pantheon of gods, but that there was a creator. And Judaism brought that to them and taught them more about that. So they were interested in Judaism. They weren't full-fledged Jews, but they were, I'm going to bite my tongue. I'm not going to say what I was going to say. Oh, okay, I'm going to say it. They were Jewish. Oh, I don't want to give that guy any more airtime. But it was kind of like that, though, right? I mean, they sort of, we kind of like this stuff, but especially if you were a guy, it was like really kind of hard to become a Jew. It was costly, but some folks did it. They were that's what they're called, proselytes sometimes, and they were on their road to becoming Jews. So in the midst of this mix, the gospel comes, right, via St. Peter and via an early community of Christians. St. Paul writes his letter to the church in Rome, to the Roman churches, right? What we pretty much know about the first generation of Christians in Rome was that there were house churches. It wasn't sort of like a big church, right? So people who were interested in becoming Jesus followers would meet in the homes of various people.
Who were they Jewish?
But some were Jewish and some were not Jewish. Some were probably proselytes, some were Jews, and some were just plain out and out pagan Gentiles who had believed in the gods in the past or had maybe no faith whatsoever and are compelled by the teaching that they're hearing about this God Jesus. And especially also about the sort of social message that seems to be going on here in who Jesus is, right? Because he's breaking down barriers of Jews and Gentiles, slaves and free. That's a big distinguisher. So class barriers are being broken down in these early communities. So you might have a wealthy person, say, who's allowing and inviting the early Christians to meet in their home because it's big enough. And never would they have a slave eating at the same table as that the slave's supposed to be serving them, right? But here's the slave sitting down at table with the master of the house, and some people found that amazingly compelling, and they talk about loving one another. They don't expose their babies. Wow, that's something. Do you know what that is? Especially if you were wealthy, but it was true of many classes of society in Rome. Patriarchal society, father knows best, father's in charge of everything. Especially again, if you were of a more wealthy class, an equestrian or somebody like that. If you're a woman and you gave birth, that child is brought by the midwife to the paterfamilias. If he takes the baby and holds the baby, he has now received that child as his son or daughter. If he does not receive that child, the child is exposed. That is, open the back door, leave her or him out, and devil come what may. There were people who would pick up these babies, and these are very good for the slave trade, by the way. And Christians wouldn't do that. And in fact, what we know about the early church is they used to be people who would go out and find those little babies out there, and they'd bring them in so that they wouldn't be exposed. So one of the things that early Christians were known for was that they didn't expose their babies. And in fact, they would pick up babies. They would bring them in. So this is all very radical to the mindset of Roman culture. right? So anyway, where was I going with that? You were asking, you had a wonderful question about were these Jews, right? They were Jews. They were some God-fearers or proselyte Jews, or they could have been pagans who felt that this message was compelling and different from the culture in which they were living.
Well,
Roman folks, right? Just plain old Roman folks. So it was all of that, right? And so that's why the letter to the Romans is a fascinating letter to spend some time thinking about, because that's all about this very question that you didn't have to be a Jew to become a Christian. You could just be a full out, formerly Aphrodite worshiping pagan, and you didn't even have to get circumcised. Wow, that's kind of nice. Don't have to do that, right? So it's a radical thing, right? And once we move into that, through the first century into the second century,
so
etc.
it's sort of opening up Judaism to the Gentiles.
Yes, exactly. And that's what's really happening in this community that Mark is speaking to. It had already been going on with Paul, because Paul is writing before this gospel is even written. So the gospels are, Paul's letters precede the writing of the gospels. The gospels come a little bit later in terms of their actual chronological time, right? This again written in the late 60s. Paul was probably killed in the persecution of Nero in around 67. So Paul's already out of the picture, or it's almost out of the picture at this point. But so that's the milieu, I guess, of in which this gospel is being written for the people wanting to know more about who this Jesus is and who this Jesus was and is in their midst. So who do you say that I am? It was a big question, right? I bet some of those same answers came up in those days, like, he's a good philosopher, this Jesus, sounds a little like the Stoics, maybe, or sounds a little like somebody else, but I kind of like that stuff. But what the early church was saying is, well, he's not only just a good philosopher, he's more than that, right? And as we get to the end, we're going to hear more about that. But that question about who do you say that I am is a big one for Mark's audience and for us as well, I think, right? So that's so then we get also this prediction of his death, right? And so Peter says, no, that's not what happens to messiahs. We're in on the ground floor of this movement so that we can get ourselves a front row seat when you become the head of things, right? And he says, Jesus began to teach his disciples, the human one, or the Son of Man, must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and priests and legal experts, and be killed, and then after 3 days rise from the dead. He said this plainly, but Peter took hold of Jesus and scolding him began to correct him. No, that's not what's going to happen. That doesn't happen to messiahs. Jesus turned and looked at his disciples and sternly corrected Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking God's thoughts, but human thoughts. Remember what happens remember in Mark has a very, very abbreviated temptation scene, right? It's just that he's goes out in the desert, he's tempted by Satan, end of the story. But the other gospels, of course, have a longer, Matthew and Luke have a longer discussion about the temptations. And one of them is exactly this, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from the temple, and then everybody's going to know that you're the Messiah, right? You're going to be the political leader, and he shows them all the kingdoms of the world. See what you can be. In Mark, it's actually Peter who is the one giving him the temptation, and his disciples are saying, no. This is not going to be the case. You really don't get this Messiah thing. that you don't get to die, you get to be exalted. And Jesus is saying, and in this section, he will predict his death in this way 3 different times in these couple chapters. 3 predictions of his passion. And this phrase, the human one, or the Son of Man, we hear that often in the Gospels. You might have heard that before, right? It comes from the prophet Daniel. It's a vision that Daniel has of someone like the Son of Man, who is like at the throne of God, who is this glorious messianic figure. And Jesus is using this of this title for himself in Mark's gospel. So we have what is sometimes called high Christology. That is like a image of Jesus in this gospel that is use of the Son of Man is like, he's not just saying he's a human being. He is like that one that was that Daniel saw in his prophecy, who is this glorious messianic figure who is now come in the flesh to do the work of the kingdom of God. So, but he's going to do it through suffering and death, not through what you might think, not through political revolution, not being a zealot, for example. That's how he thinks about it. And after calling the crowd with his disciples, Jesus said to them, all who want to come after me, or all who want to follow me, must say no to themselves, take up their cross and follow me. All who want to save their lives will lose them, but all who lose their lives because of me and because of the good news will save them. Why would people gain the whole world but lose their lives? What will people give in exchange for their lives? Whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this unfaithful and sinful generation, the human one will be ashamed of that person in this unfaithful and sinful generation. So it's about following Jesus on the way, right? And he's on his way to Jerusalem now in this little section. He's concluded his ministry in Galilee, and from this point on, he's on the road to Jerusalem, where he's going to, we know he's going to be arrested and suffer and die. And he's basically saying, yeah, I expect that. It's going to happen. And if you're my disciple, and you're walking on the road with me, this, that could very well happen to you too. It's that, and for people hearing that they could be crucified, that's a big deal. That's not like a little thing we wear around. It's not like what we gave to Leanne this morning, right? That's why I said this is not a piece of jewelry or a trophy, unless it's a trophy of the fact that the suffering Messiah has made it glorious. But it costs you everything, right? To follow this Jesus in the first century, and maybe it costs us something in our time as well to be a follower of Jesus. We get very comfortable maybe with being Christians. It seems, it's something we do on Sundays, whatever, not for these folks. Do you know the story? There's a hymn. It's not in our hymnal 82. It wasn't in. For those of you who remember the hymnal 1940. But that hymn, that the tune is most famously known for the first line, once to every man and nation comes the to this. Do you remember the verse that goes, by the blood of by the light of burning martyrs, Jesus' bloody feet I track. You don't remember that part, do you? Where's that story come from? Well, you might know the story about Nero burning Rome, right? That everybody says, Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Not true. But anyways, Nero wasn't even in Rome when Rome burned. However, he was probably behind the burning of Rome because it got in the way of his urban beautification project. Most of the areas that were burned, not all, but most of the areas that were burned were these tenement apartments that Rome was full of, wooden tenement apartments. He wanted to clear the area out so he could build his golden palace that he was wanting to build, right? So so there's this major fire in Rome. It lasts several days. It was difficult to put it out because Rome had these like little fire brigade societies in each neighborhood, and nobody really knew like where the end of their neighborhood was going to be and the next neighborhood was supposed to start. So anyways, it was a big mess, huge fire. Good part of Rome burned to the ground. Everybody is really mad about this. How could you, emperor, let this happen? Well, it wasn't me. It's those Christians. You know, see how they hate the empire? They're subversive, and they burn down Rome. So he's trying to get public opinion against them, and so he starts this major persecution against the Christians in Rome. This is during this basically around this period that this gospel is being written. And one of the things that he did to particularly display his way he's going to come down on these folks is that he has a banquet up in his palace, and as the guests are coming to the banquet, he lit the path by crucifying Christians and lighting their crosses on fire. And that's what that story is referred to in the hymn that we no longer have in our hymnal because we don't think about stuff like that anymore, I guess, right? But that's what that refers to, right? So for these folks, to hear those words, take up your cross, is very real to them, right? To make this decision to be a Christian could in fact cost you your life. And many of them did. Yeah. So, but we don't really live anymore, at least at this time, where that kind of commitment is called upon, you know, by us, right? Or from us, I should say. But maybe it ought to be, right? We need to think about when we put on that cross, like young Leon did today, what we're putting on when we put that on, when we mark ourselves as Christ's own forever. You're in this side of the baptismal font, and then there's this side of the baptismal font. And which side do we want to be on? Yeah, I know, me either. Nor did they. They didn't want it either. So Jesus is saying here in this gospel that this is going to be the path for him. That's what's going to happen, right? And Peter's saying, no. He says that. I don't want to crucify Jesus. Of course you don't, right? But he says, but Peter, I can't listen to that because I have to keep my eyes on the prize. I can't listen to your temptations that are going to make me think, well, maybe there's another way. We have to do this, maybe. And again, here and in two other times in this little section, we get Jesus saying, yeah, this is going to be it. And then we have in chapter 9, we have the story of the transfiguration, right? So we have an image of Jesus glorified. He goes up this mountain. Well, we can read it in chapter 9, say beginning of verse 2, right? 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and brought them to the top of a very high mountain where they were alone. He was transformed in front of them, and his clothes were amazingly bright, brighter than if they had been bleached white. Elijah and Moses appeared and were talking with Jesus. And Peter reacted to all this by saying to Jesus, Rabbi, it's good for us that we're here. Let's make 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And he said this because he didn't know how to respond. For the 3 of them were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice spoke from the cloud, this is my son, whom I dearly love. Listen to him. Suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. So here's this image of Jesus really as the Son of Man, right? If Daniel had this vision of the Son of Man in glory and bright light, the throne of God, this is the Son of Man that Daniel saw here. And on the one side, he has the law, that is Moses. And on the other side, he has prophets, Elijah, and Jesus in between them. So he is the one who is the new explicator of the Old Testament for the Jewish community, right? The one who is going to give them insights to read back into the story of Israel with the vision of him, his fulfilling, let's say, of those prophecies. As I said last week, we want to be careful if we not to think that Isaiah or Daniel is all about that Isaiah had some sort of trance or something and felt that all that he was saying was about something that's going to happen way in the future. No, it was Isaiah wrote for his own time and place about what God was doing in the midst of his historical situation. The New Testament reads back onto those stories, a new interpretation, but those stories meant something also in their own day and time about the political and religious situation that Isaiah found himself in. But they were reinterpreted in the New Testament to mean something new in this new religious context, right? So anyway, so there's this cloud that overshadows them on the mountain. That if people who are reading this are familiar with the Jewish tradition, they know that on Mount Sinai, when God gave the law to Moses, the mountain was covered with smoke and clouds and thunder, and then the law is given to Moses. Here, Jesus is the one who stands between Moses, the one who received the law on the mountain, and Elijah, the greatest of all prophets. And here, Jesus is standing with them. And as they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them not to tell anyone what they had seen until after the human one had risen from the dead. So they kept it to themselves. Here it is again, that messianic secret, wondering, what is this rising from the dead? They asked Jesus, and then they just moved right on. Why did the legal experts say that Elijah must come first? He answered, Elijah does come first to restore all things. Why was it written that the human one would suffer many things and be rejected? In fact, I tell you that Elijah has come, but they did to him whatever they wanted, just as it was written about him. And John the Baptist is the one that they're referring to as the one who is the coming of Elijah, presaging the coming of Jesus. So this is the famous story of the Transfiguration that appears in all the Gospels as well, right? So it's a mountaintop moment, a high point, and from this point on, then Jesus comes down the mountain and he's on his way to Jerusalem. So it's sort of keep in your eyes, Peter and James and John, this moment, because you're going to see some stuff that's going to not look like this very soon in the story of the gospel. Before we move on from there, any other comments, questions, observations? Yeah. Go ahead.
I still don't understand the Son of Man, because to me, Son of Man, human.
Yes, in fact, that's why you can translate. In fact, that's why the Common English Bible calls it the human one, right? So that it sort of says like he's the human. So he is, in fact, it's right. He's the Son of Man, and we can see here, right, that he's also somehow glorified, right? So he's both the Son of Man and the Son of God. That both of those things are happening, and the term the Son of Man that's being used here again is referring back to that vision in the prophet Daniel. Let me see if I have an actual reference here someplace to that. Daniel 7. Let me see if that's it. Take a short commercial break. Okay. If you want to follow, well, you don't. I can just read this if you want. In the 7th chapter of the book of Daniel, this section of Daniel, all of this, these visions are like apocalyptic visions, right? They're these like wild, crazy visions that Daniel has of the heavenly sphere, and the court was in session, and the scrolls were open. And I kept watching. I watched from the moment that the horn started bragging, that is like this beast that's bragging, until the beast was killed and its body was destroyed, handed over to be burned with fire. Then the authority remaining to the beast, blah, 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 blah. As I continued to watch this night vision of mine, I suddenly saw one like a human being, or like a son of man, coming with the heavenly clouds. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. Rule, glory, and kingship were given to him. All peoples, nations, and languages will serve him. His rule is an everlasting one. It will never pass away. His kingship is indestructible. So that's the vision of Daniel that is being referred to by this title, Son of Man. And we see it displayed in this transfiguration story. But Jesus is using it of himself, that he sees himself as this one who is presented before the Ancient One, God, like the Father, and is about to do this heroic work. So that's why that phrase, the human one or the Son of Man, it's a technical phrase that comes out of the book of Daniel as a title for Jesus. Right, or for the Messiah. It wouldn't just be that Jews didn't understand that just as they wouldn't have referred to it necessarily as Jesus, but it was a phrase that in Second Temple Judaism was thought to refer to the Messiah. Right.
When we were kids, we asked our Jewish friends, didn't you see that?
Yeah. Well, see, this is the problem, right? That we have, right, with this is that in Second Temple Judaism, that is, the temple that was destroyed in 70 AD, but was built after the return from Babylon. The early developments of what we now know as Judaism were taking root, right, in those days, and that's a whole complex history. That's neither here nor there, really, in many ways, for our purposes. But yeah, I mean, the Son of Man, Son of Man, he's going to be the Messiah. We know that Messiah is coming, and this is an image that Daniel had of the Messiah, and it's an apocalyptic image. That is, it's apocalyptic literature, as you may know, like the Book of Revelation, is filled with these like fanciful, crazy visions and stuff, but they all designate something in the real world, right? So, the case is here in the book of Daniel, right? That everyone's looking at me perplexed. Who is the Son of Man? It did. Oh, yes, it would have. Yeah, like as you know, that they wouldn't have thought that some, you know, glowing figure is going to just come down, right? Because Daniel wasn't thinking that. He's using these images to mask the true sort of like religious and political intent. It's resistance literature. Daniel and Apocalyptic is resistance literature. It's oppressed people who can't say what they really think because they're going to get killed if they do that. Tell things in these story ways so that people that if they ever read them aren't going, it's coded, right? And so the Son of Man is like, it's like code language. Yes. Ah, yeah, Messiah, right? Yeah, that's what you're talking about.
God looking at the human.
Yeah, but this particular human figure is also going to be the Messiah, right? But we can't say that because that might get us squashed by the Romans, right? So we use phrases like the Son of Man, and everybody who's in the know can think back on Daniel's vision of that, right? The same thing with the Book of Revelation. The Book of Revelation is written with all this crazy stuff in it because if you said it just plainly, it could get you killed by the Romans, and this is one thing we would prefer not to do have happen. So we tell these stories in this particular framework called apocalyptic. We have different understandings of apocalyptic in our day, but you know, be that as it may, I'm getting really into the weeds and off the deep end here with this. But Jesus, like I said, 3 different times predicts that this is not going to end very well for him. He's on his way to Jerusalem. When he gets to Jerusalem, things are going to really turn bad for him. I want to end with this last story of the healing of blind Bartimaeus that happens at the end of chapter 10. Remember, I said that Act 1 ends with the healing of a blind man. Act 2 ends with the healing of a blind man. A guy by the name of Bartimaeus, verse 46 of chapter 10. Jesus and his followers came to Jericho. Now, Jericho, by the way, is like the last stop before we get to Jerusalem, right? It's on the road to Jerusalem. And as Jesus was leaving Jericho, together with his disciples and a sizable crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, Timaeus' son, was sitting beside the road. When he heard that Jesus of Nazareth was there, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, show me mercy." Many scolded him, telling him to be quiet, but he shouted even louder, "Son of David, show me mercy." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him forward." They called the blind man. "Be encouraged, get up, he's calling you." Throwing his coat to the side, he jumped up and came to Jesus. Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said, "Teacher, I want to see." Jesus said, "Go, your faith has healed you." At once he was able to see, and he began to follow Jesus on the way. So the first blind man doesn't follow Jesus. He's just healed in 2 stages, and he goes away happy, right? But this guy becomes a Jesus follower and follows him on the way to Jerusalem, which is on the way to the way of discipleship, the way of the cross. Now, this guy, though, his name is Bartimaeus. This is a very strange name because Bar is the Aramaic word meaning son of, right? Like Simon Bar Jonah, right? We know that about Simon Peter. Bar, B-A-R, means son of. Bat, female, daughter. Right? That's why we have bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, right? Son of the covenant, daughter of the covenant. But this guy is named Bar, but his name is Timaeus, the son of Timaeus, we're told. So it's even translated, Bar is translated for us to be the son of Timaeus. Timaeus' son. But it's an Aramaic beginning on a Greek name, which is very strange. Why is that? There's a iconic dialogue called Timaeus, one of Plato's dialogues. This was the one dialogue that any moderately educated, don't even have to be like really educated, one dialogue that many educated Romans would learn in school, this dialogue of Timaeus. And it was very popular because it Plato posits in this dialogue, or Timaeus posits in this dialogue, that there is one creator of the universe who is the source of all things. And that we can come to know this creator of the universe. And we can come to know him, and the way that we can come to know him is because we have the gift of vision. We can see the stars and we can learn about the planets and all of that. That this is our eyes are the vehicle by which we can see the truth of this creator God. It may very well be the case that this bar Timaeus is really a cipher for Timaeus, that Mark knows about Timaeus probably, if he's a moderately educated, because he can write, right? And he knows Greek, he knows Aramaic, and he knows Latin. Right? So he's no slouch, and he probably knows about the story of Timaeus. And it could very well be that even though this guy might have been called Timaeus, he's bringing up the story at this point, especially because it's about a blind man gaining sight about the truth of the one true God. And so here we very well might have a story for people like the audience of Mark, pagan Gentiles, right? Saying, oh yeah, Timaeus, yeah, we know about Timaeus. And let me tell you about this one true God. Let me tell you that he came, and that is true. Timaeus was able to see, but only so far, until he came to know Jesus. And so he throws aside his cloak, his old clothes, and his old way of life, everything that he knew, and he comes and he follows Jesus on the way. Early Christians would have left their clothes behind them on the font of baptism and come out the other side after they were baptized and follow Jesus on the way. So it could very well be. Now, do I know that this is exactly true? No, and because scholars don't know that, but it could very well be the case that because this was such an important dialogue of Plato's and had a particular meaning for Jews, especially Philo talks about this dialogue. In fact, one of the great Jewish philosophers, that it could have been used in this gospel for this very purpose, to tell people who might have known the story of Timaeus, right? That you too can leave aside your old life. Your eyes can be open to know that the one that Timaeus talks about, the God that he talks about, is really the God of Israel who's come to us in the person of Jesus. So there you go. I don't know if that's true or not, but it sounds good to me, and it gives you an insight into potentially the way this gospel could have been used, right, in its early incarnation in the first century in the city of Rome.
Also pretty close to the death and resurrection.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's right. So this is this story is sort of the climax of the gospel up to the Passion narrative, right? Which begins in chapter 11 when Jesus enters the city of Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, what we call Palm Sunday. There's no palms, but we call Palm Sunday. There's only palms in John, by the way. There's branches in the other gospel. So branch Sunday kind of doesn't really have the same cachet. It'd be easier for us here to just have branches, right, than import palms from wherever we get them from on Palm Sunday. So here we are today. This is round two. We don't miss that we skip next week so that we can have the parish meeting in this very room. And then the last week of July, we will meet with our final,
Last week of June. We have
yes,
another
thank you,
meeting.
thank you. Time and space have never really been like my greatest skills. But you're right, it's last week in June. Thank you, thank you. What's that? I've other skills maybe. Yes, yeah. Father Dan always says, you know, you have many gifts and skills, but time and space are not. That's very true.
Right.
So, all right. So let us close with prayer briefly, if we can. We give you thanks, oh God, for allowing us to gather in this day to chew on your word, to make yourself known to us in the breaking of bread, as we've done this morning already, to make yourself known to us in one another, and then your living word that comes to us through the writings of your servant Mark. We pray that we could gain the courage to trust you and to fail not when times of challenge come our way, whether they be persecution, whether they be the stresses of each of our lives, and ultimately the day in which we will all face our own deaths. Help us to have confidence that you have gone before us on the way into life eternal. Help us to be your disciples in our day and time. All this we ask in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.